My name is Anshu, Inside U.S. Trade. Thank you to the panel for being here. My question, I guess, is there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between what I'm hearing from you and what the administration is saying. On speech on Monday, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross basically said that, the U.S. doesn't really have that much to lose from a trade war with China, right? Like in terms of the trade volume, basically, China would have to basically tax, greater than our total trade volume in order to have a material effect on the U.S. economy. They're dependent on U.S. technology. They need to import food in order to feed themselves. So I guess my question is, does China have more or less to lose in the U.S. in a trade war? And then second, the consensus among most of you seems to be that this should be sort of a multilateral approach, bring more cases to WTO. Mr. Dooley, you mentioned the Boeing case, for example. But that case, I believe, took more than 10 years to resolve, maybe 14 years. And made in China 2025 would presumably be in 7 years. So I guess, would that approach just be too late? Can we afford to wait that long for a multilateral approach? Thanks.
Well, maybe to respond to your last statement about the length of time to resolve the dispute through the WTO, I think we would all agree that the process needs to be reformed and modified and modernized so that you can have quicker decisions. But what I would also say that alternative approach also reduced the prospect of action 10, 20 years ago that would have been a response by tariffs that could have led to a trade war. And so, the point I'm making is if you have these multilateral institutions that provide recourse, that is an alternative to a unilateral approach of imposing tariffs, which is what the administration is doing now. And the difference is when you go down the path of imposing tariffs, you invite a retaliation that again is going to have significant adverse impacts. And so, no one is saying that the WTO is a perfect organization, but what I think is clearly evident, and Scott and I had the opportunity to participate in a Ways and Means hearing a few weeks ago.
3 hours and 30 minutes.
3 hours and 30 minutes. And you've had a lot of different sectors that were talking about the retaliation, whether it be the ag, whether it be the steel fabricators, whether it was the chemical industry, where there was companies that were sourcing high-grade steel for whatever reasons can't be manufactured in the United States competitively, but it's being manufactured in Canada, it's being manufactured in Germany, it's being manufactured in the UK. All countries that have pretty much the same cost of production that we have in the United States. And so, that's where we're very concerned. We do not agree that this administration is going down a path which is going to advance the broader interest of the U.S. economy and U.S. workers.
So if I could talk just about who has the leverage point of this. I mean, we do, and Dean alluded to this too. We have a large economy. 1 out of every 5 Chinese exports comes straight to the United States. That's 20% of their export volume, particularly in goods, comes to the United States. That is a high intensity, and that gives us some leverage. I mean, the American consumer is in a lot of ways indispensable for China. It would lose a lot without the American consumer. We have exports. They've increased into China. I think on a goods basis it was about $135 billion last year. And again, in a $19 trillion economy, that's not insignificant. But from a purely macro point of view, Secretary Ross is right. We have leverage. We have never really utilized it in a meaningful way before. But it's there. Our banking exposure in China is pretty small. I mean, yes, China has some bonds, but there's plenty of buyers for U.S. Treasuries out there. It is a low-risk investment. The level of risk is continuing to go down even as our debt has gone up unimaginably. So we're much better positioned than a lot of people think we are. Now, do you want to fight that war? Of course you do not want to have an escalating, spiraling type of situation. But we've never even tested the kind of the premise that we can utilize this leverage.
Yeah, this is not simple, and so that's important to keep in mind when we speak on these panels. We make it including myself, I make it seem as if, why don't they just do X or Y? And so I want to explicitly share the sense of humility that this is really complicated, and I hope they get it right. I think Scott is right when he credits Secretary Ross for noting that there is improved leverage because of the increased focus. I think Secretary Ross is completely wrong in estimating the impact. His focus has been on tariffs and the implications of tariffs, and that the US can go higher than Chinese exports into the United States, so what else would they tax? The reality is that they don't have to stop at tariffs. They could foreclose the market to American companies, which would have significant downside impact for the American economy and the global economy generally. And so I think the public statements have been a bit too cavalier. Comparing the implications of the steel tariffs to 0.002 cents on a can of beer is just silly. It doesn't speak to the real integrated nature of the economy and what the implications would be.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to the impact on China. I think short term, China can withstand, on agriculture specifically, I'm talking there, they can withstand it. As Cal said earlier, U.S. agricultural products face a lot of competition from around the world, a lot of alternative sources. I look back in sort of the medium to longer term impact though, because one of the things President Xi has been trying to do since he became president is to really focus on the Chinese citizen, improving lives for Chinese citizens in general. And for us, that means, improved diets, more meat in their diets, higher quality diets, and improved air. These are two specific projects that are very, very dear to our hearts, because we think that U.S. Supplies, whether that be grain or meat products or whatever, are very competitively priced and very high quality. And Chinese partners like doing business with us in general. And so we hear, when these tariffs went in on sorghum and dried distillers grains and things like that, we heard very vociferously from feed miller partners that they really wanted us to fight these battles, because they wanted that source of supply. And same thing goes into ethanol. We've been working in projects in ethanol on clean air initiatives, and a lot of you have been into China, where you land and you look out and you can't even see the tip of the wing of the aircraft because of the smog. These are projects we've been working on together to develop solutions with a role for trade that actually allows China to improve the quality of life of their citizens, both in terms of diet and the air that they breathe. Very important to us. But also, I think, immediate impact in terms of China, all due respect for our friends from Australia, they're paying $100 more a ton for sorghum from Australia than they would get from the United States. That has immediate impact. So I think that, yes, China can probably survive for a while on the food side because of the way the situation is there, but medium to longer term is going to have an impact.
And I just want to say one thing is, let's not forget consumers, and I realize no one really wants to talk about them, but the fact is, if we think that families are doing better because of tax reform, well, we're basically going to take that away from them. If we're raising prices, and the ripple effect through the supply chain of increased prices here obviously has an impact. There's also, though, the impact in China. So for a lot of brands and retailers, China is a huge expansion area right now. If the Chinese shut down, those opportunities for sales in China, for opening your own stores in China, that's going to have a huge negative impact as well.
Jennifer Hillman, right in the middle.
Hi, Jennifer Hillman from Georgetown Law School. So I have a question. When the original 301 report came out describing the tech transfer issues in the IP, I think generally there was universal consensus around the world from our trading partners of a complete agreement on the substance of that report. And I think some initial thinking that everybody would join the United States in this effort. When you look at what happened when the delegation went over to China 2 weeks ago, and you saw the demand list of the United States, and without a doubt, number one on the demand list was that China must lower the bilateral trade deficit with the United States by $200 billion, 75% of which had to come from increased purchases by China. That's pretty immediately off-putting to everybody else in the world in terms of whether they can stay on the same page with the United States on this. So if you agree that this idea of fixating on the bilateral deficit is actually turning away all of our allies, how do we get off of this idea that the goal here is to simply reduce the U.S. bilateral trade deficit in goods with China or anyone else? That's sort of question one. Question two I had is, a lot of you talked about the WTO and the ability to bring WTO cases. But if we looked at what's happened recently, the cases against China have been arguably not all that many and relatively narrow. I mean, even the case that was filed after this 301 report is a narrow case, under 28.2, I mean, sort of very specific patent provision of the TRIPS agreement, not the kind of big, bold case that you would think would have come out of a big, bold report like the 301 report. Why? And is there anything we can do to think about a bigger, bolder case against China rather than the small, little narrow ones?
Well, let me add actually to Jennifer's question. The administration actually, in talking about the 301 report, has said that with the exception of the one WTO case that they filed, everything else that's in that report is outside of WTO commitments. So, are we in a world here where a stronger case could be brought at the WTO on these issues? Or are we indeed in territory where we have identified a multitude of issues that we have with China that are no longer, we believe, covered by the WTO?
Yeah, so I think the report was big and bold and incredibly well done, the 301 report. The Commerce Department deserves credit for the work that they did. The USTR thought it was incredibly well done. I think the answer to both is what was alluded to by Congressman Larsen, which is the focus on tangible near-term wins. I think it is unlikely to be successful if we spend time trying to push the administration off reductions of the trade deficit. So rather than suggesting that that shouldn't be a part of the solution set, we've mostly been pushing hard on making sure the solution set is expanded to include expanded market access to key markets in China.
So there's a lot to unpack in the questions there. With respect to the WTO, it may be a product of a couple of different factors. One of which is that, to date, and again, I would make the strong argument that the WTO case filing process has been an ineffective mechanism to achieving real, lasting, measurable changes in China's behavior. With respect to certain things that are, I think, deemed very critical to the government of Beijing. Second is that filing those cases involves the cooperation of industries in the United States, and there's an upside to that. There's a downside to that, but there is a risk, and then there is the time issue. Is that this is an inefficient way. In a very lengthy way of trying to settle some major disagreements. And if we thought, EU Airbus is a good example, but these are two kind of rules-based trading systems that had a disagreement on subsidies. And that took, that's taken years upon years to reach some sort of semi-conclusion. The expectation that that's going to happen with state-led capitalism, I think, is, again, really, really far-fetched. In a lot of ways, so I don't think it's the most effective mechanism to deal with issues. On the issue that Erin raised with respect to the 301 report, a lot of it being outside the scope, I think that's probably pretty accurate. And also, to Jennifer's point on the trade deficit as well, I think there are a lot of things that are outside of WTO that the United States has legitimate complaints about. China's behavior, expectations of behavior in the future. I think I look at the U.S. list of demands as a starting point in the negotiation, not as an end point. And I'm as trade hawky as they get, and I think I acknowledge that exchange rates probably drive a lot of trade flows along with trade agreements and other types of behaviors. And so I think it's hard to get at through a bilateral negotiation.
We should be clear about what the objectives, and more importantly, the administration should be clear on what the objective they're seeking to achieve here. I completely agree that the WTO will be and is ineffectual in dealing with state-led capitalism. And if the goal of the administration is to get China to make structural changes and abandon state-led capitalism, it's bound to fail. And so we've just got to decide, what is the objective here? Because we're not going to, the United States, no country, I think, is in a position to persuade China that the approach that they've adopted for their economy is one that they should abandon. I see no evidence that it's even feasible, given the way that President Xi has consolidated power in China. It ain't gonna happen. And so I think you're absolutely right. That is a part of the debate that's happening in the administration. And there are people in the administration who think the battle here is to change China's structure. And I just think, I question whether that is a battle that's worth fighting and one that could be won.
So to Dean's point, I think Bob Lighthizer mentioned this as well. I said the goal is not necessarily to change China's system. I mean, it's not our role, but it's to mitigate the impacts that system has on the American economy. And I think that is a legitimate question.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I've been looking this direction, so there are questions over here, right up here in front.
Thank you, reporter from Voice America. 2 weeks ago, when we were here, one of the panelists talked about he mentioned that it's not a trade war, it's more a high-tech war. And when I remember when 301 reports came out, and most people talking about that the Trump administration is actually targeting China's program, Made in China 2025. So I'm just wondering. They will also mention that it's trying to protect the high-tech competitiveness of the United States in the future. So I'm wondering what the panelists share with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it was a mistake for the administration to put as much emphasis early on China 2025. I think it goes to this point, and I think Scott's nuance on it is the appropriate one, which is how do you mitigate the impact of that kind of economy on the rest of the world? By focusing on China 2025, it suggested as if the United States had a concern with China planning its future, which China should plan its future. The United States should as well, Europe should. And so now, to the extent that in planning for its future, China is using state support to undermine other economies and industries and sectors in other economies, that's highly problematic and has to be addressed.
Dan Pearson, Pearson International Trade Services. This question comes from 10 years I spent at the U.S. International Trade Commission, part of that with Jennifer Hillman, dealing with steel cases, which are half of the Commission's anti-dumping countervailing duty docket, and you just learn a lot about the industry if you spend enough time in it that way. I'm really struck by the incongruity of how relatively small the steel industry is compared to agriculture, fashion, information technology, and chemicals. I mean, you could double the size of the U.S. steel output, and they still would be much smaller than any of these. The steel industry employs at most 140,000 workers in the United States. It accounts for 0.2% of gross domestic product. Okay? Just look downstream at the downstream users. They're much, much larger. The people who take steel and make it into something else. About 6% of GDP. 6.5 million workers. Okay. Are you concerned, Mr. Paul, that taking this highly protectionist approach, where we already have U.S. steel prices the highest of any major country in the world, based on the existing anti-dumping countervailing duties, you throw the 332 on top of it, you take steel prices even higher. Are you going to kill your domestic user base by forcing them to have high-priced steel and having them lose a lot of their business to Canada, Mexico, and even China?
No, I don't think you are. I mean, you've accurately characterized kind of where steel lies in the U.S. economy. I note simply that, you know, the national security rationale, I think, is a very valid one. There's one armor plate producer left in the United States that's capable of supplying the U.S. And we don't like to think about real wars at all, but they have happened from time to time. And the idea that you can depend on an ally from across the ocean to supply armor plate during a shooting war, you know, I think that bothers military planners probably. So you do have a real rationale for this. I mean, in terms of the impact, again, if you look at the size and scope of the tariffs, they are not significant, particularly when you consider most steel consumption goes into things that have, you know, R&D costs or other things like that far exceed the material costs. And the idea that in this economy, that a maximum kind of 25% steel tariff is going to wreck the steel-consuming industries, I think is really far-fetched. And I think the approach the administration is using, and yeah, it's going to take a while to unwind the product exclusions, but on the country exemptions, it's actually turned out probably to be a much more nuanced approach than many people had thought. And again, I think that you're going to find that a lot of the most significant damage is going to be mitigated. The goal is to increase capacity utilization in steel and aluminum, get it up about 80% so that they can start making capital investments again. And I completely disagree with the premise. I think that much as during the Bush tariffs, the thing that really impacted steel-consuming industries was the Chinese consumption surge of steel and aluminum in 2004. That had a far more shocking impact on prices than the Bush tariffs ever did. And they're a very small part of what goes into these finished products. I don't see that, you won't see any measurable impacts of this in the U.S. economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if we can kind of maybe come back to this question of what the fundamental change in China looks like. Way back in the day when I was a baby USTR staffer, we were working on the OECD shipbuilding agreement. And for those of you who don't recall the OECD shipbuilding agreement, it was an international agreement that was going to limit countries' subsidies to shipbuilding so that everybody could have a level playing field. Ironically, Congress rejected it because it didn't want to be restricted on how it could subsidize the shipbuilding industry, and then it didn't follow through on doing so, and so shipbuilding is not a major industry from the US. I raise this because China is willing to subsidize industries. That's really at the core of what is at Made in China 2025. It's among the reasons why you see overcapacity in sectors like solar panels and steel and aluminum and other areas. We are not willing to subsidize our industries like that. So given the fact that, Dean, I think you're right, that we are not going to change China's system, but some sort of fundamental change needs to happen. What does that look like? What fundamental change would be realistic for the U.S. to ask of China that could be delivered on that would address our concerns?
So if there were an easy answer to this question, we would be well on that path. I don't think that there is an easy answer to that. That's how these problems get kind of pushed down the road. I do think that it will take some experimentation to get there, and that ultimately it can be some combination of carrots and sticks. And let me explain just in particular to steel how I think the theory is how this plays out as a case study. So everybody was screaming because, well, China's the big problem in steel, yet they're only the 11th largest importer in the United States of steel. So why all of this this tariff nonsense. That was kind of the argument. So, there's kind of three layers to it. One is obviously the direct layer, and Dan is right that there's a lot of anti-dumping, countervailing duty fees that are levied on Chinese steel already. But to add to that, the second is that China's very adept at getting the steel through other markets into the United States. So the issue of transshipment is a big one as well. And third is to apply pressure from the major steel consuming economies in the world onto China to reduce this overcapacity, because it is disruptive. It's disruptive for steel producers all over the world, as well as steel consumers. It's market distorting. I mean, yes, you love those free prices, but if there's a surge in consumption in China, the prices spike. I mean, it's not good to have Beijing calling the shots in the world steel market. And so you've seen some evidence that Justin Trudeau never talked about anti-dumping or Chinese imports coming into Canada before the 232s. He does now, and Canada's making some efforts. Same goes for the EU. They put into place a safeguard mechanism to guard against import surges. And again, the idea is to quarantine that bad behavior. There's not an elegant solution to this. If there were, it would have been developed by now and deployed. And so I think we're probably in a period of experimentation, but one where you're trying to mitigate the risks as much as you possibly can.
I think it's a great case study, in part because of, NAFTA has played into Canada's focus on this, but I think it's a great case study because it speaks to the hard work that needs to be done internationally in order to diagnose early China's dumping behavior, which they've done in so many industries where they create overcapacity, take it over, and then own. And so diagnosing that early and then taking steps immediately to deal with it on a multinational level, I think that is, via WTO is not adept at moving quickly, and so there are areas where the WTO will be appropriate and others where we're going to have to experiment and move multilaterally to address inappropriate market distortions from China.
And I would just add to that in agriculture, I think you're seeing this happen to a certain extent already through the WTO. There's, again, core problem in China is very inefficient policies that over incentivize production in agriculture. And it's created tremendous problems for the Chinese treasury as well as for their agriculture sector. And when we work on these problems, in China, we always see when the tariffs started announced, we always see two camps evolve. Hardliners who say, yes, we don't want that. We don't want to be dependent on international and multinational companies. We don't want to be dependent on the U.S. for food supplies, versus reformers, true reformers who say, yes, we have inefficient policies in agriculture that overstimulate production. We've got to reform these things to have more modernized Chinese economy. And on the case, stepping back a question on the WTO case on domestic subsidies, we have over 20 some co-complainants on that case, 20 countries who are joining into that case saying we've got to get to the core of the issue, which is inefficient policies, overstimulating production, international market distortion resulting.